May our intention, oh no wait, an unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Well, I thought I might explore a little bit my own sensibility so far of around koan studies, and I'm aware there's people in the audience who know all kinds of stuff about that, and probably some who don't. My imagining when Allison invited me was kind of like a group of peers, so I'm just going to put you in that bin, who are curious about koans and have wondered about exploring them some more, and I hope what I have to say will be at least encouraging and maybe helpful. Or maybe you think I'm full of hooey, which also could be encouraging, study more. So koans are really just kind of the strange genius literature of our tradition, I think. And working with them can be so revealing and interesting, and also baffling, confusing, interesting, weird, subtle, often obscure due to old Chinese cultural references that we don't necessarily get, obscured by translation, because we're not getting the in-jokes around which characters were chosen. And, there's homonyms and homophones and characters that look similar and so on and so forth. So how would we know any of that in English? And yet, somehow, even in translation, all these centuries later, these stories have a certain power to them, a certain opportunity, a certain efficacy, unlike anything I've ever encountered. Early on, I heard the koan stories described as the family stories of our tradition, Soto Zen tradition, or Zen tradition in general, which is nice and homey to think of them as the family stories. But it's also good to remember that these are actually only the story of a small selection of valorized male masters from the Tang dynasty in China, as retold later by Sung masters and pretty much only men. And I'm also a fan, so I'm a fan of the original collections that I've studied so far, but I've also really appreciated getting to supplement from wonderful modern collections of Zen stories, koan stories that do feature women. Excuse me. The best known of which probably being the great 100-story volume, The Hidden Lamp, Stories from 25 Centuries of Awakened Woman by Sue Moon and Florence Kaplow. So if you don't have that book yet, I highly recommend getting it. One of the great things is that Sue and Florence invited contemporary women teachers to comment on each of the stories they were able to find, and they found them all kinds of places, ancient and modern sources. And maybe I wondered if there might be some of those wonderful women teachers here today, and I think there are. So my gratitude to our teachers. So I've done various different kinds of koan work, and I feel like I'm just barely getting started at 55. Firstly, listening to many talks on koans from my primary teachers, and also the last few years getting to do some of the more intense one-on-one kind of koan introspection challenge work, a little bit with the teacher in the Sanbo Kyodan Diamond Sangha, Robert Aiken lineage, and also lately with an American teacher in the Korean Sungsan world, and they appreciate the same stories in very similar ways. And this one-on-one work, it's really interesting, challenging, fun sometimes, intimidating at times. But that work, somehow, there's some access to something, some kind of deep, grounded, embodied intuition or clarity, and they do have this unfortunate reputation from the early days of American Zen as being like inscrutable puzzles designed to blow your mind up, and that's not really right, but it's not exactly totally wrong either. And when I, have a response that somehow fits or feels right, I know it, even as the teacher, agrees with me, or, if they don't agree with me, they're usually right anyway, So it's really interesting. If you ever get the opportunity, there's not that many teachers who are good, I think, at offering that kind of work with koans. So that's a little hard to arrange, and by far the only way. Not the only way. Sorry, not the only way to work with koans, but really interesting. Another thing I've done that's really great and really accessible is reading koan stories with small groups of senior students in the sangha. In those discussions, it's really surprising how much reveals itself that you just somehow didn't see, even though it was right in front of you, reading these on your own or reading them to yourself. Those gatherings we often read out loud, and either just the story or maybe we're reading a book with a commentary. We do similar, by the way, with Dogen's Shobogenzo essays. Something about reading aloud with a group of Dharma friends is so enlivening and so empowering. And part of why I got on to trying to give talks about koans is I set myself a project, which was to give a Dharma talk, on each of the 48 koans in the Mumon Koan, which, as you probably know, is probably the most popular collection in Japan, early 13th century collection put together by one of our Chinese ancestors, whom the Japanese called Mumon and the Chinese call Wumen. And the title of the book is kind of a play on the teacher's name, Mumon Kan, Wumon Guan, in Chinese-ish. I'm sure my pronunciation is poor. So the name of the book is literally No Door Gate, a gate with no door, a gateless barrier. And so I'm a little fond of this book because that character's in my name too, this character for gate, the no, or the mon, sorry, the mon and nomon. So in my case, the no is a pretty loose use of an unusual character that my teacher translated as responding. So if I'm responding gate and have this conceit to think that I can always open and close at will, I figured it's probably good for me to study this literature which says there's a barrier and there's no gate. So how can I live into that a little bit? And so it's just really been interesting to bring each story up myself, and through the process of giving and preparing the talk, see what's revealed. And it's also really interesting to see how people respond. Interested, baffled, bored. Once in a while, somebody will show up who has some background in koans and will, in the discussion afterwards, try to challenge my understanding and ask me a checking question. And, and that's okay. I just try to be as kind, as clear as I can. What do I know, But it's really wonderful to, I think, bring these up and demystify them a little without demystifying them too much, because they're pretty mysterious. But for sure to free us from the unfortunate burden that they wear of being some kind of merciless puzzle that's designed to ultimately frustrate and cut off the mind road and usher you to enlightenment, And next thing you know, you're writing a best-selling book and starting your workshop tour, or even more suffering to think that you could have that, and you're never going to have that. But they are powerful stories, and they're part of the enlightenment journey in their own unique way. We have much to learn from them. But I feel a little cautious about valorizing any one thing. It's wonderful to remember the beautiful emphasis in Soto Zen on emptiness, that all teachings are ultimately empty and provisional and just what we need, but no more, no more. And we encounter this insight all over the place if we pay attention. On my jog the other morning, for instance, I saw a crew finishing up a new sidewalk. And there was a pair of workers doing the final smoothing of the surface. One guy, and they were both men, was holding this long pole, which was attached to this broad rubber smoothing device. And the pole was pretty long, so he's pretty far from the smoothing thing. And the guy at the other end, who's sitting right next to the wet concrete, carefully placed this smoothing mop on the concrete, and the guy with the pole would very carefully draw it towards him, and then they'd move it and do it again, and move it and do it again. And around them was a whole other big road crew and lots of machines and lots of stuff happening. But these two guys, they were just so there. They were very quiet, giving each other just quiet signals about what to do next, little hand signals, and very focused. And just the whole thing was breathtakingly beautiful to watch. So I thought, well, that's no different really from the majesty and beauty of any kind of practice, koan studies or other practices. That these are powerful pointers to the suchness of our lives, whether it's concrete smoothing or ancient religious rituals. And that our opportunity and our invitation is to be open to all the teachings that this deep universe offers us, and all the opportunities to free us at last from habitual views and narrowness and our own wound up mind. See, they're treasures, but I feel a little cautious about getting too excited about them, as amazing as they are. I think it's also helpful in kind of demystifying a little bit to know something of the literary history of these. Koans became a sort of legal precedent, of the enlightened way on how Zen practitioners meet and understand life. The term koan seems to mean something like public case, but a little bit indirectly. I read that the characters refer to a special desk the magistrate would sit at in the court, and where he would proclaim the case at hand, And so the word case is like a legal case. So very interesting to be giving this talk a few hours after the verdict of the Derek Chauvin case. So what does that verdict tell us? What do the verdicts of these ancient masters tell us? But apparently their origin before that is less official and officious. They seem to actually have evolved from like poetry games and party games that the Chinese literati would play. And I'm sure there's probably much wine involved. The part of classical education in old China was memorizing oodles of famous poems. And the games were something like one person leading with a couplet from one poem and their friend needing to answer with a couplet from another poem. I don't know if they're exactly couplets, but they complemented the first and somehow fit in various poetical and literary dimensions. So you had to be pretty on it and have a big mastery of poetry at your disposal, and maybe, again, a little wine at your moon viewing party. So in a way, that's kind of perfect, Although we Zen people do often take ourselves a bit seriously, and it is serious, what we're trying to do. But it's also wonderful that it's a religion whose holy literature may have evolved from drinking games that uses also a lot of slang and mock violence in the course of trying to give its deep wisdom. And I think this is probably true, that these great stories of the Zen masters and their disciples were probably told and retold in monasteries, for decades and centuries. Kind of like the way we'd tell old family stories or tell jokes, Did you hear the one about Master Jiao Zhou? Oh yeah. What about Master Nanchuan? What would he have said, And like all stories, I'm sure they evolved. Are they literally true? I think we'll never know. As far as I know, the masters named in the classical koans were all historical figures that we think lived. But since they were probably oral literature for many years, like most of the rest of Buddhism, who knows who actually said what and how much was ascribed later to somebody by a later teacher. The use of koans as these sort of intense objects of challenge and inquiry and insight probably evolved fairly late, too, in the so-called golden age of Zen in China. And was picked up by the school that became the Rinzai school much more strongly, but of course it's a mistake to think that the other schools didn't appreciate, love, and practice with these stories, and Dogen comments on many of them. He had his own collection of 300 of them, the so-called Mana Shoba Genzo. And it's really fun as you kind of get to know these stories to read what Dogen does with them, often turning them on their head or shifting the emphasis. The one I was remembering was in his essay Kato, Entangling Vines, where he retells the wonderful famous story, probably most of us have heard of, about Bodhidharma at the end of his career, asking his students to present their understanding so he could, figure out who to give the robe and bowl to or something. Remember the one about you've got my skin from your presentation, you've got my flesh from that presentation, this other one, you've got my bones, and finally you've got my marrow. Where usually the marrow is the best. Dogen pretty much says, best schmest. Think again. Look more deeply. Consider this carefully. So you're just getting started with koans. A great book for exploring is a translation of this book that I gave all the talks on, the Mumon Koan, Robert Aiken's translation and commentary called The Gateless Barrier. He himself studied in the introspective, intensive style and also was, as you know, a great scholar. And so he does a very workmanlike job commenting on each story and sifting things out and suggesting connected cases. Sort of a combination of historical analysis and family stories and deep insight. So I thought for this talk I would just mention, having said all that, let's get to some koans. I thought I would just mention a few favorite stories from the Mumon Koan in my little exploration of it. And some different examples of the kinds of stories that you find in this literature. So case 5 is kind of a classic Zen conundrum. The kind of story that showed up early on in English as an example of the tricky, impossible logic of Zen. Here's the story. The priest Xiangyan said, "It is as though you are up in a tree, hanging from a branch with your teeth. Your hands and feet can't touch any branch. Someone approaches from beneath the tree and says, 'What is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming from the west?' If you do not answer, you evade your responsibility. If you do answer, you lose your life. What do you do?" The priest Xiangyan said, "It's as though you were up in a tree, hanging from a branch by your teeth. Your hands and feet can't touch the branches, they're bound. And somebody approaches below and says, 'Hey, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming from the west?' If you do not answer, you evade your responsibility. If you do answer, you lose your life. What do you do? What do you do?" So easy to write that off as just kind of a wild, silly story, but actually it's the story of life, right? We're always faced with impossible choices, probably every day, but we're so good at normalizing and moving on and being a little step removed from the depth of our life that we don't always notice how impossible our choices are. What do you do? Where do you give your life? Who do you serve and how? And do you find yourself tempted to try to evade your responsibility? And what ultimately happens there? You can only hang on so long with your teeth. What do you do? And this koan is one where I did have the opportunity to work with the teacher one-on-one in that more challenged introspective style, and it was really interesting studying this and being frustrated with it and exploring it. And finally, kind of a really surprising sort of release of energy, letting go of striving and trying and just throwing myself out of the tree in a certain way. So they're really interesting on all levels. And even just the simple interpretation is really powerful too. How do we approach impossible choices? Simple but not easy. You're hanging from a tree. What do you do? Case 16 is a beautiful exploration of why we practice. Personal favorite of mine for a long time. This one goes this way. Yunmen said, "See how vast and wide the world is? Why do you put on your 7-panel robe at the sound of the bell?" That's the whole story. Sometimes they're very short. One line or one saying. Yunmen, who was one of the teachers in this canonical group, said, "See how vast and wide the world is. Why do you put on your 7-panel robe at the sound of the bell?" And he's not asking somebody 2,000 years ago. He's asking us now. Why do you put on the robe? Why do you do this practice? Why did you come to this ZBA Dharma talk? When you're fully open to this vast, wide world, this unknowable world, how do you know that the best response is this response, this practice, this robe, whether you wear a literal robe or another kind of robe? What's your intention? Why do you practice? It's a good question for us all to hold and bring back again and again. And notice too that when you answer this question, you're a bit like the man in the tree for yourself, you know? You just give the glib answer and fall to your death. The obvious answer you always tell people or tell yourself. Is that the true answer? How vast and wide the world is. Why do you put on your 7-panel robe at the sound of the bell? Lovely. Case 37 is one of many pointers to suchness, you could say. The unbelievable power and beauty of things as they are. Or as Suzuki Roshi famously said one day, it's recorded, that we should all focus on things as it is. Things as it is. I learned not too many years ago that someone who was there tried to correct his grammar, because he was Japanese and his English was not always perfect. And here he is saying this phrase, we should all study things as it is and see things as it is. And they asked him, didn't you mean things as they are, Roshi? And he said, no, that's what I mean. Study things as it is. The plural collapsing into the singular and opening up again to enclose the plural. So anyway, that's maybe the topic of this case, which is as follows. A monk asked Jiaozhou, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming from the west? Master Jiaozhou said, the oak tree in the courtyard. A monk asked the teacher, Jiaozhou, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming from the west? What is the meaning of everything? Master Jiaozhou replied, the oak tree in the courtyard. There are many, many versions of this question and response, this koan in the literature. Sometimes the answer is a 7-pound bag of flax, or maybe it's a mountain, or a word, or a phrase, or the movement of a flag. These stories, I think, encourage us to open up wider than we can imagine, being able to open up to the vastness and majesty of reality that's in front of us all the time. The way things are just as they are. A tree so utterly and completely and totally a tree beyond treeness, and the depth of that shakes the universe, but we don't always notice. And these old stories point us back to that. In the obvious kind of mindfulness way, you can think about that. We're rushing to work, we pass a tree, nice tree, if we even notice it all next, And of course that lack of engagement can also fall into all of our activities, doing our daily Zazen practice on autopilot, answering a million emails, so on and so forth. But inevitably, the practice and our sanghas and our teachers and our own suffering reminds us in a deep way that that's not enough. That's not a way to live. And it's not inherently about slowing down or something or looking or something, but ultimately it stops us in its tracks. And we can't help, in a moment of deep surprise, to see, look at that tree. Look at this moment. Feel this breath, We can do this in kind of practical ways, for sure. It's great to sit our zazen every day, even if sometimes we're on autopilot. It's essential. You can also go on a slow walking meditation in the park. Stand and face a tree and really face a tree. As you breathe with it, perhaps you'll start to feel in some way the flow of the sap in the xylem and phloem, which is all speeding up in spring in the north. Its circulatory system just below the bark. Perhaps you'll sense the gases being absorbed and released by the leaves, oxygenating our entire world. What a miracle. Perhaps your skin will tingle a little as you feel the wild excitement of the energy of the sun banging into the leaves and triggering photosynthesis. A leaf is Buddha, for sure, no question. Every one. What is the meaning of Bodhidharmas coming from the West? What is the deep truth of our practice of our lives? This tree, not trees, not any tree, this tree, this one right here, right now, this one in the courtyard. Bodhidharma is over there right now, walking slowly behind the tree. Probably he's walking his dog. And Dogen and all the ancestors constantly encouraging us to go beyond, to investigate deeply, and to let ourselves be stopped, to let ourselves be frustrated and baffled by the universe, or in this case, the universe as constellated in these wonderful old stories. Because how can that story not bring you up short? What is the meaning of Bodhidharmas coming from the West? Esteemed master answering right away, the oak tree in the courtyard. What? And in that what is a realm of possibility, right? That wasn't available before. So as the last example, sometimes I want to mention a koan that's more like a story. They're not always so short and direct. They also explore Chinese folk tales and include some of the wilder mythology of Buddhism. Zen seems so practical and down to earth, but of course it's part of this vast, wild cosmological tradition of the Buddhas, So anyway, case 42 is one of those kind of stories. It's a little bit longer. I'll go back through it once or twice. Once in the olden days, in the time of the world-honored one, Manjushri went to the assembly of the Buddhas and found that everyone had departed to their original dwelling place. Only a woman remained, sitting in samadhi close by the Buddha's throne. Manjushri asked Shakyamuni Buddha, "Why can the girl get near the Buddha's throne while I cannot?" Shakyamuni Buddha said, "Bring her out of samadhi and ask her yourself." Manjushri walked around the girl 3 times and snapped his fingers once and took her to the Brahma heaven and exerted all his miraculous powers to bring her out of her meditation, but in vain. The world-honored one then said, "Even 100,000 Manjushris cannot make her wake up." But down below, this is still the Buddha talking, down below, past 1,200 million lands as innumerable as the sands of the Ganges, there's a bodhisattva called Ensnared Light. He will be able to rouse her from her samadhi. Instantly, the bodhisattva Ensnared Light emerged from the earth and made a bow to the world-honored one, who gave him his imperial order. The bodhisattva went over to the woman and snapped his fingers once. At this, she came out of her samadhi. That's the little play, little wild story. So the world-honored one and Shakyamuni Buddha are the same character, of course, our main Buddha. Manjushri is the great bodhisattva of wisdom. We also have a powerful but unnamed woman practitioner. So that's interesting. Sadly, women don't get a lot of airtime in these stories. Here we have one who's in a deep meditation state. And in the final part of the story, a lower level bodhisattva springs forth from the earth, named Ensnared Light. Ensnared Light. One of the qualities of these stories is often a kind of comeuppance, Often excuse me, often an unnamed monk or some low-ranked character is kind of the fall guy and gets straightened out by a powerful teacher who's usually named. Sometimes the tables are turned, the powerful teacher gets straightened out. It's very exciting, And this is more the latter situation, although the powerful teacher is beyond human. Manjushri here is the embodiment of perfect wisdom. In the opening of the story, he shows up at the kind of celestial zendo, went to the assembly of the Buddhas, only to find out that everyone had left. And somehow he missed it. So we're already off to an interesting start in the story. The Bodhisattva who has perfect wisdom doesn't know what's going on. He shows up in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he looks around and he sees there's still two people left. I'm using people kind of loosely here. These are kind of people-ish figures. A deeply practicing woman practitioner and the Buddha. And excuse me. And the way it's told makes it sound like the deeply practicing woman gets it and has some deep understanding and is very close to the Buddha right now. And Manjushri is out of it. The way that's represented is that he sees this woman seated in samadhi next to the Buddha's throne, and he asks the Buddha, why can this girl get near the Buddha's throne while I cannot? So you can imagine some spiritual force field or something is keeping him away or something from the Buddha's throne. But in any case, Manjushri is now doubly frustrated. And the Buddha suggests that Manjushri ask her, saying, bring her out of her samadhi and ask her yourself. And so he does a little ritual. He walks around her 3 times and snaps his fingers and transports them to a heavenly realm. If you didn't know, Buddhism has many heavens and many hells, Sometimes people wish Zen wasn't a religion, but oh well. And presumably that's somewhere where he can really have a lot of influence over her and see into what's going on with her in her deep samadhi. But it doesn't work. He exerts his miraculous powers to bring her out of her samadhi, but in vain. So he can't even talk to her. And the world-honored one, the Buddha, says, well, yeah, that wasn't going to work. Manjushri is not the character for the job here. We need another bodhisattva who's deep in the earth, called ensnared light bodhisattva. He can do it. And sure enough, he or she, I don't know if the person is gendered, does instantly do it. So this is a wonderful story for us, I think. Kind of back to what I was trying to say at the beginning, to take practice seriously but not valorize the precious too much. Because Manjushri is the preciousest of the precious, right? The embodiment of perfect wisdom. And so apparently he took himself too seriously to where he, in this instance, didn't understand, wasn't clear, wasn't able to operate. And maybe was too pure. Because the Bodhisattva who springs from the earth, who in one of the translations, which I prefer, is called ensnared light. In another one, he's called delusive wisdom. He's a little earthier. He's a little more messed up, a little more tangled. And his wisdom is not of the heavens, but of the earth. A little more flawed, which gives me hope, for all of us flawed people trying to do this Dharma trade, And he understands. He can meet this woman where she is and connect with her. So, beautiful story. And also one that we could enter in many different dimensions, in many different directions, to step inside that play. What do you do when you are Manjushri, too pure, thinking everything should go the way it's supposed to go according to you? and there's somebody else, somebody else seems to be getting the approval, that you crave. What do you do, And maybe we can learn from this ensnared, light, delusive wisdom bodhisattva that it's okay to be messy, it's okay to be incomplete, it's okay to have not had time to do all your homework, or be the best of the bunch, but you know how to show up. And that's the other part that's beautiful about that story. Buddha thinks of him and he shows up. So, it's a little musing and framing around koans. I hope that's helpful. A rich and powerful literature can sound more than a bit odd to our ears, and it's good to be honest about this stuff and not pretend it makes that kind of sense that supposedly things do make sense in, but they do have their own version of making sense that's different. And it is really fascinating to hang out with them and to work with the whatever initial resistance or confusion or, over-interpretation or whatever it is that comes up first for you, and hang out with them, hopefully hanging out with them in the company of friends, whether it's a group of people studying together or I think for those of us who give Dharma talks, the process of writing the Dharma talk is in some strange way a conversation with the sangha as you're writing it, and that dialogue seems to happen. Over the course of writing talks on all 48 of these, more often than not, I would kind of get started and think, oh, I've hit the wall. This is it. I can't do this one. My vow to do all 48. Maybe they probably won't mind 47. I'll be okay. But I made that intention and I tried to live by it and just continuing to work with it and chew on it and sit with a little. I didn't always make time to sit with these for weeks. Which is kind of a classical trope. Sometimes I just didn't have time. I'm busy. But still, somehow, either in the preparation of the talk or even in the giving of the talk, words that I had not planned to say arrived, and some level of meaning or some little, beam of light, little small beam of light came shining through, and the Sangha seemed to find it all pretty helpful and pretty illuminating and encouraging, which in the end is what we're really trying to do here with our vast Dharma resources, is encourage each other, right? Encourage each other to practice, encourage each other to keep on, encourage each other to take care of each other and take care of the world as best we can. And to do that well and sustainably, a little wisdom sure as heck helps, right? So maybe here's one of many wonderful sources of wisdom. Just sitting there on the shelf, maybe getting a little dusty, waiting for you to come and make it alive now. Because that's how they are. They're not old stories. Actually, in the end, they're only alive now. So, I'll ask the assembly here, what is the meaning of Bodhidharma's coming from the East? Thanks for listening to all that. So I opened with our usual opening chant from our family. I'll close with the usual closing chant if I don't get it tangled up with the first one. May our intention equally extend to every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to become it.
Nomon, would you be able to entertain a few questions if there are any out there?
I hope that they'll be entertained by my answer. Yes, absolutely. Yes, please. dialogue, you know.
So you can just feel free to unmute yourself.
Nomon, my Dharma name is Sangetsu. I once heard a teacher who was quite adamant that koans had an answer. It was the answer, if you, and could not countenance any other answer or presentation other than what he had been taught. And I was at a workshop a number of years ago with Bernie Glassman.
Mm-hmm.
And I posed that question to him. I was very curious about what his take would be. And he kind of gave a sort of long, rambling answer, but from what I could get out of it, his response was that, well, there are right answers. There are some that are really wrong. That you've entirely missed the boat. And then there are some which are somewhat in the middle. Whereas one teacher I worked with would sometimes say, when I always did one-on-one koan with teachers, and he would sometimes say, well, you're in the right church, but the wrong pew. So that you could you're kind of there, but maybe not as there as he wanted me to be. And I was just interested in your take, especially when you have group discussions of koans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I've heard some of these, and again, I've heard some answers that just seem to be really out there. Anyway, I was just curious on your take.
Well, I mean, I think the word answer is a little loaded, I think, you know, like, are they questions, you know? They certainly pose something that we can respond to, and there are many ways to respond to them, obviously, is my feelings, and I just said that for 40 minutes or something. But yeah, in terms of those very direct, you know, speaking from the heart responses, you know, what comes to me is a line from that great Soto poem, Song of the Jewel Mirror Samadhi. It says something like, the answer is not in the words, but it responds to the inquiring impulse. Like there's a feeling to it, right? Isn't that been your experience? Zoketsu, there's a feeling to it when there's an alignment, when there's a depth, when there's a connection. You feel it, you know, and it's not exactly which words you say. And actually, the Kwanam, the Korean group I'm working with a little bit now, theirs always have to include big gestures too. It's very embodied, very physical. It's not even necessarily words, you know. So it's a response, you know. And I think what's useful and interesting is, can these encourage us to respond in a fresh and new way to our lives, you know, in that context. So I don't know. One answer seems a little narrow, but who am I to argue? I was taught that whenever I meet my betters, the proper response is always, "Thank you for teaching me." So I'm sure that person is absolutely right.
That's the way I felt when I was talking to Bernie. He seemed to operate on a very different plane from most human beings.
Yeah, you know, and is right and wrong really that helpful to us here? You know, Dogen was big on leaping past right and wrong, right? Yes and no. Yeah, thank you for your comment. You want to bring anything else up?
Hi, Nomon. Gosho.
Gosho sama.
Sama, oh my. Well, so speaking from, you know, one thread of the Radha Yasutani lineage, the main purpose of engaging in koan with a teacher especially, I mean, there is the working with koans as very rich and helpful literature, which I think we do much more in the West than has been done previously, kind of from our literature background, you know. But it's very rich, and John Tarrant, has the same similar kind of method. But the main point is to awaken, and then with the first koans and then the successive koans are about clarifying that awakening. So would you agree? Is that your perspective in working with koans?
Well, you just told me that's the answer, so how can I argue? Well, they certainly are powerful engagement with something, and I have not been trained so much in that language, to awaken, as I'm a little bit wondering, is there an act called to awaken? But yeah, yeah, can't argue with that. Powerful technology for awakening, for sure. I'm a little less binary about the idea, I think, than maybe you are, though.
Well, say more about that. What do you mean by that?
How can you be so sure there's exactly just two categories, awakened and not awakened?
Well, it's not that there's two categories, but there's awakened and not awakened.
Thank you for helping me awaken a little bit more.
Tim?
Yes. Hi,
Hi, dear. Do you think there's a particular koan for our time, this point in time?
That's an interesting question. I'd like to throw that back to the whole assembly. Is there a koan for our time? I mean, if you think about, and here we have different approaches, right? Thematic, and as thematic literature, and as, supports for awakening. Supports for awakening, they're all for our time, and they're all for every time. But I do think something about the wonderful phrases, around intimacy, intimacy and not knowing, and the quality of, being free from. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Is there a koan for our time? What does everyone else think? Is there a koan for our time? I have kind of a half sense of where I want to go there. I'm not quite sure where I'm going.
Well, I do appreciate what you kind of encapsulated when you started saying that these are really about how do we approach impossible choices. To stand on the cusp, to stand on the razor's edge and keep walking.
Yeah, I'd vote for Up a Tree. Yeah, that's your first one there. I'd vote. That's a good one for our times, isn't it? Yeah.
We are up a fucking tree, no question. Yeah. On the edge. Yeah, thank you for that comment, Enrico.
One of my favorites is, in order to be a good Zen student, I must go straight on a narrow mountain road that has 99 curves.
Yes. Blindfolded, walking backwards.
And the other one is from Yogi Berra, the great Yankee catcher. When you reach a fork in the road, take it.
Yes. Okay, maybe does that feel complete for now? Since nothing's ever complete. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Allison. Thanks, SCBA. Thank you.
Nomon, thank you. Thank you. This is really interesting. I appreciate it.
Really appreciate your indulging me. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here. We'll see you hopefully next month. Take care.